Before we begin tonight's program, on behalf of the Jerome Robbins Dance Division, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Library for the Performing Arts is situated on the traditional homelands of the Lenape people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself, Lenape Hoking, and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. We additionally acknowledge the unrecognized generational labor of enslaved African Americans in this place, as well as the labor of immigrant communities. We offer our deepest respect to all of these people and ancestors, past, present, and future. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the program Transmissions, which has actually been several years in the making. Some of you may have been fortunate enough to visit the exhibition Transmissions a couple of years ago at the Whitney Museum. And what you might not have noticed then was that many of the materials that were on display came from the collections of the Jerome Robbins Dance Division. And we're deeply grateful to the curator and artist behind that show, Nick Mauss, both for his use of our collections and for also allowing us to facilitate tonight's program. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to our colleagues at the Whitney Museum for being so gracious. We have a wonderful panel this evening. I'm going to give you a quick bio for each of them, and then I will hand over the proceedings to Nick. Our first panelist is Emily Coates, who is well known to the Dance Division as she is a former fellow with us. Emily is a dancer, writer, and choreographer, and associate professor of theater and performance studies at Yale University, where she created the dance studies curriculum. Coates has performed internationally with New York City Ballet, Mikhail Baryshnikov's White Oak Dance Project, Twyla Tharp, and Yvonne Rayner. Some of her collaborators include Liz Diamond, Josiah McElhenney, Will Orzo, and Emmanuel Kwon, with whom Coates held a dance research fellowship from 2019 to 2020 here at the Dance Division. Together with physicist Sarah Demers, Coates co-authored Physics and Dance, which was published by Yale University Press in 2018. And for the 2019 Performa Biennial, Coates collaborated with Yvonne Rayner on revisiting Rayner's dance parts of some sextets, which have not been seen since 1965. She's currently at work on a larger project, Science Dances, which assembles stories of dance and science in dialogue over the past 100 years across geographies and cultures, manifesting in multimedia form, live performance, film, and writing. Our next panelist is Marcy Kwan, who is a scholar of American art history whose work focuses on the intersection of fine art and vernacular practice, theories of modernism, cultural exchange between Asia and the Americas, critical race theory, and folk and self-taught art. Kwan is an assistant professor in art history at Stanford University, where she is also a founding co-director of the Asian American Arts Initiative, at the Cantor Center. Her book, Enchantments, Joseph Cornell and American Modernism, forthcoming from Princeton University Press this March, is an interdisciplinary work of scholarship that situates Cornell's art within the broader artistic, cultural, and political debate of mid-century America, exploring Cornell's engagement with a number of key episodes in American modernism, including the transatlantic migration of surrealism and ballet to the United States, the efflorescence of folk art in the 1930s, abstract expressionism, and the emergence of New York school poetry and experimental cinema. Central to Kwan's innovative account is her theorization of enchantment as it pertains to the history of American modernism. Our third panelist is Hilton Als, the Pulitzer Prize-winning critic and author of The Women, which was published in 1996, and White Girls, which was a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award and the winner of the Lambda Literary Award in 2014. He is an associate professor of writing at Columbia University School of the Arts and has also taught at Princeton, Yale, Wesleyan, and Smith. Als has collaborated on film scripts including Swoon and Looking for Langston, and edited the catalog for the Whitney Museum's groundbreaking 1994 exhibition Black Male, Representations of Masculinity in Contemporary American Art. Als is also a prolific artist curator of exhibitions. In 2009, he worked with the performer Justin Bond on Cold Water, an exhibition of paintings, drawings, and videos by performers at La Mama Gallery. And more recent exhibitions include his complex, multi-part emotional retrospective at the Artists Institute in 2016, God Made My Face, a collective portrait of James Baldwin at the David Zwirner Gallery in 2019, and She Who Is, Adrienne Kennedy and the Drama of Difference at Artist Space in 2020. And finally, the person who's bringing it all together this evening is the original curator and artist of Transmissions, Nick Mauss. Nick Mauss's drawings trace unexpected arcs into a multidisciplinary practice that includes scenography, writing, performance, and the making of exhibitions. In 2014, Mauss intervened in the first European survey of the work of Florian Stettheimer at the Lenbach House in Munich. He was a 2016 fellow at the Center for Ballet and the Arts and conceived the exhibition design and catalogue for Designing Dreams, a celebration of Leon Bakst, at the Nouveau Musée National de Monaco. Transmissions, his 2018 exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art, examined the social and aesthetic interdependence of modernist ballet and avant-garde practices in the pre-Stonewall New York and blurred the boundaries between an art historical exhibition and an artwork. In 2020, Mauss presented an exhibition titled Bizarre Silks, Private Imaginings and Narrative Facts at the Kunsthalle in Basel. All right, so as I said, the original impetus for tonight's conversation was my long conversation with Nick as he prepared for his show at the Whitney Museum. And for those of you who did not see it, it got rave reviews. Alistair Macaulay, who at the time was the chief dance critic at the New York Times, said it was an installation, a collage of several art forms, a revisionist investigation of New York modernism and sexual expression, and an essay in queer theory. The juxtapositions show that Transmissions is a work of creative imagination as much as a revelation. You go to sample it as history, you absorb it as poetry. So a lot of ideas in that to unpack. We have, as you just heard, a wonderful panel. And with that, I will hand over to Nick.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Emily, Marcy, and Hilton for being here. The work that each of you do is incredibly inspiring to me, and I'm thrilled that we can come together tonight to talk around this book, but more broadly about our various approaches to writing, performing, and conceiving histories. I thought a way to lead into our conversation would be to share some images of this book and talk about how it came together and how it was formed very much by the Jerome Robbins Dance Division. Transmissions was the title of an exhibition I made at the Whitney Museum, as Linda said, which centered on the simultaneous articulation of modern art and modern ballet in New York between roughly 1930 and 1950, when both forms started to seep into popular consciousness. I didn't set out to make an exhibition about ballet necessarily. I tend to work very obliquely and to wait for various strands to come together into a knot, and then I know this is what is interesting. But the general impulse for Transmissions, the place that I started from, began with questions I had about how artworks and their makers appear and disappear, what kinds of stories are told about them and by whom, and how the museum as a framing device makes things visible and also invisible. It was also born out of a curiosity about New York as a place and as an afterimage. When I began looking through the Whitney collection, I came upon a lot of works that I knew already, but also many that were completely new to me. And one thing that united them, or that sort of pulled me to them, was the fact that they had a very strong relationship to performance, to the dramatized, emotive, and even sexualized body that you see in dance. But these artworks are generally not contextualized with the performances that inspired them. Rather, they're isolated within a very artificial historical continuum in which art objects especially illustrate what to me is a normative notion of modernism. Many of the cultural protagonists I was looking at were fans of and sometimes also collaborators in the world of ballet, modern ballet. But it took work for me to understand that ballet, with its rigor and tradition and all the conservative baggage that it has, was at a certain point a highly experimental and messy field through which all of the arts crossed. And then later, it was relegated to a blind spot that would make us believe that art history and performance history are separate trajectories, when in fact they're utterly entangled. So aside from my searches in the museum storage, I started frequenting the dance division, where I found the counterparts to many works in the Whitney's collection. The dance division, for example, has a huge trove of Pavel Chelichev designs for costume and stage. You see Chelichev's 1946 anatomical painting from the Whitney's collection on the left, and on the right, his study for the costumes for Errant, an early Balanchine ballet from 1933, which is now lost. And I was able to match the library's Chelichev study for Errant to a performance photograph by the German photographer Ilse Bing, whom Chelichev had commissioned specifically to document his designs for this really trailblazing multimedia production, which featured lighting schemes based on Aurora Borealis and huge lengths of silk falling from the rafters. There's many more interrelationships among artists like this that run throughout the book and kind of account for its branching logic. The library also had things that the museum did not have, which made me wonder how these value judgments are made. What belongs to the museum, what belongs in the library, what is considered art, what is considered ancillary to art, and how important it is to undo these categorical distinctions. The library owns hundreds of George Platt lines, prints, and negatives of dancers. So crucial documents of 20th century American culture. And also this confounding marionette, which served as a costume study for Ruth Page's, to my eyes, very Bauhaus-inspired ballet, Variations on Euclid. Or this photograph in the lower right-hand corner of dancers in Dorothea Tanning designed costumes for the 1946 ballet Night Shadow. And so I began stitching together the collection of the Whitney with holdings of the library, stitching art history to dance history in order to map out the larger social, artistic, and also sexual scenes in which these artists moved around events that they witnessed and participated in together and drew inspiration from. And I started recreating and also often fantasizing proximities between forms that had been sort of prized apart over the course of nearly a century. I was totally stunned the day I filled out a library slip for a Eugene Berman maquette, listed as being made of colored paper, watercolor, gouache, metallic pigment. And Jennifer Eberhardt, one of the librarians, wheeled over this totally incredible object, the back of which still bore a label from the Museum of Modern Art, which had deaccessioned it in 1948 when its theater arts department was officially dissolved as part of a streamlining of the modern canon, which is a revision that continues to affect the way that we perceive culture to this day. I was even more stunned when studying this changing screen, also by Eugene Berman in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, just decoupaged in his drawings and sort of torn bits of singed doilies, to find that the same Concerto Barocco set was right in the middle, as you see here. But the true revelation for me at the library came when I found these slides by Carl van Vechten, marked up in his handwriting on the frames of the slides, and depicting hundreds of New York City dancers, choreographers, costumers, and lighting designers spanning the 1940s to 1960. And you know, one of the things that's so shocking about them somehow is their blazing color. They look almost like stained glass, and in their seriality, you also get a sense of time passing in the photo studio. which happened to be his apartment, a few feet in the victim's apartment. One of the dancers I was collaborating with said of these slides that they look as if they'd been taken yesterday in an apartment in Bed-Stuy. Because parallel to this process that I've been talking about, kind of weaving between the museum and the library, I had started another process, which was a collaboration with 16 dancers currently working in New York, mostly in the downtown dance scene. It was important to me that this exhibition propose a total integration of dance with works of art and a roving museum public, rather than the way dance is often seen in the museum as quite decontextualized. And I also chose not to work with ballet dancers from an existing company who would, rehearse old repertory, but to use this as an opportunity to try something else. So I cast dancers who had a foundational history with ballet, but no longer identified with the form, and proposed that we work in an experimental way on renegotiating ballet legacies through contemporary practice. And none of these dancers, or a very few, had ever worked together before. They had all accumulated different layers of training and were strikingly distinct as artists. As a starting place, I took very literally Shirley Clark's statement that dance is what happens between the poses. And I asked the dancers to choose 2 George Platt Lyons photographs and create a connective tissue of movement between them. And I realize now that this notion of betweenness structured transmissions overall, and that it was fixated on interrelationships and transformation between people and forms of expression, rather than on isolated objects or events. All of these various dance inflections and schools in the rehearsal room. We had Cunningham dancer, modern dancer, self-taught dancer, many postmodern dancers, someone who had worked with Ballet Theatre of Harlem and New York City Ballet. They found things to say to one another, and to the artworks we were looking at. I remember a day when Brandon Colwiz and Quentin Stuckey, who had just met in the rehearsal studio, developed a duet inspired by this little Gaston Lachaise statuette of a nude striding Lincoln Kirstein. And that duet was then taught to and adapted for the other dancers as part of a long sequence, which I edited together from this kind of excess of solos, duets, trios, and quartets that had been made over the course of several months of our working and dialoguing together. So you see that movement sequence performed here by Burr Johnson and Alexandra Albrecht, as captured by photographer Paula Court. And in these performance and installation views by Ken Ukiishi, you can see how viewers were able to move around all sides of the stage that the dancers were performing on. There was a transparent scrim on the back, but really no fixed vantage point, no single perspective from which to behold the danced exhibition, and no real beginning or end. So it allowed for the performers and the artworks to speak to each other very directly and to evoke relationships between them. Everything could be seen from multiple angles, which also meant that the viewer had to constantly renegotiate her position in the space with regard to her status as a spectator, viewer, performer. And that back and forth in the performance and exhibition with the audience began to happen and sort of elaborate very organically as the exhibition went on, and the performance really took command of the space. The dancers knew exactly how to calibrate it, how to pluck quotes out of the air, out of the images in the space around them. So for me, the really intangible but most important work in the exhibition was being done by these dancers who expressed what Transmissions was ultimately calling into question for me, which was the memory of the body against the memory of the institution. So this book has become a repository of images and texts and ideas that were generated by the exhibition. More so, I would say, than really a catalog. One thing about dance is that it makes no objects, but it produces new images and language in excess. You know, if you think about how ballet induced mid-century poets into new forms of ekphrastic writing. So this exhibition resonated in a lot of different ways that were incredibly moving and unpredictable for me, which I wanted to record. There's a long interview with the performers in which they address everything from how we work together to questions of authorship in dance, to their fears, regarding the norms upheld in ballet and colonialist narratives that inhere in balletic gestures. And there's a lot else in the book, which honestly I never wanted to stop working on. But I'll wrap up by saying that this celebration of transmissions, nearly 3 years later, was planned as a reunion for the many contributors and collaborators who helped realize this work. It means a lot to celebrate this at the library because the entire project essentially grew out of what I found and observed here and the people I met at the dance division. And in light of what we're all living through, I just want to emphasize the importance of this place, which is a real confluence of living and recorded knowledge. And Linda and her staff have been the incredibly patient and generous guides to me and many others of these knowledges. Performance especially is the art form most violently eroded by the structural inadequacies that this pandemic has exposed. And so I think in this time where we're unable to be together to support, to witness, and to remember forms of cultural production that depend on social life, we see even more clearly the role played by the dance division as the repository of some of the most fragile art forms and relationships and residues of cultural memory. So thank you to Linda and to everyone at the library. So from here, maybe we can bring in Emily.
Thank you so much. I was so intrigued by your show when I saw it in person a few years ago, and I'm just delighted to have gotten to know you in these 3 years through your work in our revival of parts of some sextets with Yvonne Rainer for Performa 19. You are a natural performer. You do nothing like nobody's business. And then to be here to celebrate with you this book and this accomplishment. I just want to say that I came of age as an artist at the School of American Ballet and at New York City Ballet. I came when I was 14 years old in 1988 to New York for a summer program. I came subsequently for 2 more summer programs, and then moved to New York and joined New York City Ballet in 1992. And where I danced for 6 years. And, it's a remarkable accomplishment when your exhibition actually transformed the way I see and understand my origins. And I can say that one of the many things it does for me in this project, Transmissions, is that it makes me understand I came of age as much in the home of Lincoln Kirsten as George Balanchine. And that your unearthing of these iconographies, Lincoln's visual interests, resonated with what was all around at SAB and City Ballet, the Paul Cadmus images, the George Platt lines, PR photos. Those are all very familiar. The Cadmus paintings were on the walls. The Kirsten portraits were around. Those are all very familiar to me, but we were so focused on the contents of the studio and the ballets and the technique and the training that I did not fully register just how much they had created this home together. They were something of this odd married couple, in a sense, that had found ways to both actualize their interests, and Lincoln supplying in so many different things, but the iconographies, you know, Balanchine, I think, just wanting to be in the studio making ballets. But I'm going to show this real quick. To me, this is one of the brilliant narratives you lay out visually in the book. So this is the book, Transmissions. And you can see this George Platt Lynes image that Nick found. And then you connect it so beautifully. You don't just go from here to here. You show us that George Platt Lynes and his photograph is very much in this genealogy that led us to the iconography of the School of American Ballet and this pentacle. And I will say that this shape was on all of our t-shirts in 1988. Students from all over the country, middle America, coming to New York and buying up these SAB t-shirts and never knowing, never understanding, forget tracing back to like the Renaissance, you know, but even 20th century history, never having made that connection. But what a beautiful connection you have made to that image.
So glad that you see it, and that that it makes sense to you also, because you know, the photograph, the George Platt Lynes photograph, was in a stash of thousands of photographs at the Kinsey Institute in Bloomington, Indiana, that I was, you know, going through like a crazy person and sort of memorizing. And that picture of the naked figure from behind, standing on paint cans and his fingertips being held up by hands coming from the outside of the frame, just stuck in my head, and I really couldn't make heads or tails of it. But I mean, George Platt Lynes was incredibly prolific and very, very experimental in the studio. So I just assumed it was a kind of, you know, a new idea about the nude, until some copies of the School of American Ballet programs came into my hands, and I recognized that photograph. And then the photograph turned into an emblem that harkens back to the Vitruvian Man, and those kinds of echoes and transformations over time were something that I wanted to lay out in the book again and again, because I found myself in the process of looking at this work, having all these memories and finding images appear in different ways, or, you know, paintings being translated into print, and you know, appearing on ballet programs, and then being adapted and becoming something else. And so that the way these ideas were constantly being used and reused was fascinating to me. But I think it's interesting also to hear you say that, as somebody who is so completely in a later aspect of that world, that its history was not really all that available to you.
I would say Lincoln Kirsten was around. He was a presence who would slide in quietly to watch class. But shamefully, I think many of us were so focused on our ballet training, we may have known who he was, but never fathomed the full history. I do want to ask you, because we've talked about your and our interest in collaging original objects and source materials. I wanted to ask you, you had an extraordinary group of contemporary dancers, and I'm curious why you chose to work with a group that, as you say, had a foundation in ballet, but were not performing in ballet or considered themselves ballet dancers. Given your interest in original source material, when you could have worked with New York City ballet dancers, who today are still removed from the source generationally in their technique and their understanding of the repertory, but they're as close as you can get to the original source of Balanchine, who is a through line in Transmissions, as you can get in the world today.
one thing that motivated me to work in this way is that I was looking when I first went to the library for period films of ballets from the 30s and 40s, and as you know, there's not much filming of dance until probably the 60s, and with ballet there seems to be almost a rule about it. Diaghilev forbade it, and then I think maybe people even after him thought it was tacky, but there were just a few films that were incredible because they showed me a way of dancing that I've never seen and I will never see, because the training, there was a kind of insouciance, like a real wild spirit in this phase where Balanchine was there and really custom making the dances on his dancers that I hadn't seen. And so I realized that because there are no real films, there aren't actual documents, there's photographs and paintings and all of this, I was sort of operating around a void, and that seemed to me like a great opportunity to not recreate or claim that it would be possible to recreate these period dances, but to see if contemporary dancers might find something of interest in this material. And I remember one day actually when all 16 of us went to the dance division and looked at some of these films, and it was so fascinating to me to hear people point out, well, look at how they land. That's, that isn't done. We should try that. Or, they found all these things that I couldn't even see, and brought those back into the studio and kind of wove them into what was being made. I mean, I think the clearest answer to your question is that I didn't want this to feel like an historical exhibition. I wanted this to be about the present moment, because a lot of the work that I was seeing, and I think a lot of what attracted me to a tenor that's in this work, reminded me of the period that we're living in now. But what also happened is that I was surprised to find that this period was, much more experimental and willing to take risks than we generally assume. And so that I felt like a connection had to be made to our moment there as well.
You do write in your essay in the book, you thought of your own misconceptions of ballet, or that it was a kind of rigid thing. And when you began to do this work and explore American ballet in the 20th century, it began to crack open. And I feel like the dancers you worked with for the exhibition did capture the heterogeneity of, the ways that ballet lives in the world. There are misconceptions of ballet within the dance world in terms of what it is. And your conversation at the end in particular really got at the ways that we all live with it and form personal relationships with it, love relationships as much as fraught and neurotic relationships. That's very much captured in your conversation with the dancers. Even ballet dancers have a fraught relationship with ballet in different ways and figure out ways to make it one's own. Do you know?
Well, this is something that's fascinated me. I mean, one of the many things that's fascinated me about your work from the beginning is how you kind of, you operate as both a dancer and a choreographer and a writer. You're kind of inside and outside, and somehow the object and subject of your analysis in your work. I mean, the way that you sort of bring the kind of embodied knowledge you have of Balanchine to bear on the work that you've done with Yvonne, which is like another form of embodiment, is fascinating to me. And I mean, just as much as I think, your work on physics, and then as a kind of choreographing force, it's there's a lot there, but I think what I'm curious to hear about from you, who you have this kind of repertory in you, and yet you also sort of, you work in a way that to me feels very intertextual. You quote other dances, you bring all these roles into to participate in your dances. How does an idea like reenactment and dance figure into how you think about your own work, or historical reenactment?
It came to a head, I would say, in the transition I made between leaving New York City Ballet and then when I was with Mikhail Baryshnikov, I met Yvonne Rainer when he invited her in to make a work. And that was after Many a Summer Dies a Swan. We then went separate ways, but in 2005, Yvonne reached out to me and asked if I would be up for wearing pointe shoes in a re-envisioning of Balanchine's Agon. So and of course, you know, I was not wearing pointe shoes at the time, but if Yvonne Rainer is going to ask me, I would wear pointe shoes for Yvonne Rainer. And so I was imported in this postmodern dance context into a work called AG Indexical, which premiered in 2006 with 3 other wonderful postmodern dancer choreographers, Patricia Hofbauer, Pat Catterson, and Sally Silvers. And big chunks of Balanchine choreography were quoted. And it was right around then too that I was starting to make my own work. And that idea of postmodern collage and that idea of a reenactment that's an homage and a critique and an intervention and a transformation, all of that got sparked in encountering Yvonne Rainer's working methods. And it's really given me permission to then go off into these fields, as I see you do. You know, I think I'm juxtaposing dance histories and science histories and trying to find ways to pull materials from here and there and put them together in ways that make us understand them differently. And that's exactly what I see you doing with different kinds of domains in transmissions.
Thank you. I'm gonna switch over to Marcy and then we'll reconvene later.
See you soon.
Okay.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Marcy. So, I mean, we actually met in transmissions, and then, you know, I got to know about your work and about this book of yours that's coming out, Enchantments, Joseph Cornell and American Modernism. And I remember feeling a little bit embarrassed because I had really, the way in which Cornell appeared in the exhibition was I think it was too much. There was too much romantic ballet, and I was trying to steer away from that. I love this question that you have brought up in talking about what led you to write about Joseph Cornell, which is why it is that some ways of being in the world are taken less seriously than others. And I wonder if you would talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Nick. Thank you for the invitation to be here for convening this conversation. I mean, your conversation with Emily just now blew me away. It's gonna be a really fun talk. And, you know, I just wanna say that by kind of way of answering your question, when I first met you actually in transmissions, I remember walking through the show. I actually flew to New York to see the show. And then I was walking through and I just hear this person say, you know, Marie Taglioni's fans like loved her so much that they like bought her ballet shoes and ate them. And I was like, that has to be the artist. And then I introduced myself to you, and it's been wonderful to be in conversation with you since then. And I think that, you know, that question that you just posed, and that is one that's like really driven me to write about Cornell, is one that I think is wrapped up in that anecdote, which is so important. It tells us so much about the effective charge of ballet, of dance, the kind of almost desire for possession or consumption, you know, the violent edge of that. And yet it could just be, that kind of story could just be dismissed as not having enough kind of historical significance, or perhaps even apocryphal, right? And so I think that what I am interested in my book is that, you know, was looking and kind of following Cornell and seeing the way that his work opened me up to, in some ways, this very history that you yourself have, you know, really enlivened for all of us. You know, the ways in which that kind of history has been foreclosed by this emphasis on facts and rationality, right? You talk about, in one of my favorite passages in the book, you know, the knowledge stored in the body as opposed to the institution. And I guess what I was thinking about was, you know, the knowledge stored in relationships, in like encounters with works of art, and the ways in which not attending to those types of very intensive, effective, personal, erotic connections has really allowed certain histories to kind of slip out of art historical purview.
Well, I'm also very interested, I guess, somehow in relation to that, because there's the living relationships and these kinds of intimacies that pervade the circles in which Cornell moved. But then something that you do in your book, which I find fascinating, is that you kind of track his resonance to speak about the work of Betty Saar, Robert Rauschenberg, and Carolee Schneemann, and you bring him into you know, a much more recent past. And I think those names feel quite jarring in relation to most people's understanding of who Cornell is. But it seems to me like a brilliant thing to do.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so they actually all knew him, or they knew of his work. You know, Rauschenberg was, I think, in the 1950s in Rome, like making these works that were like interested in like little like bits and objects and things. And I think he was grappling with, you know, that past. And in another potentially apocryphal story that is, you know, that was recounted to me by a collector, like Rauschenberg worked for one of the galleries, Charles Egan, that Cornell showed at, actually with, you know, Egan was also a big abstract expressionist gallery. And because he worked there, he was like the only person who worked there with a driver's license. And so he would actually apparently go to Utopia Parkway and pick up the Cornell boxes to bring to the exhibition at Egan, you know, like stuff like that. You know, Simone Veil's parents were collectors of Cornell. And so he was like percolating, right? And similarly, Carolee Schneemann served as his assistant. And Betty Saar saw his works at his first retrospective in Pasadena, curated by Walter Hopps, who came to his work. And I think through that sensibility, through seeing the Arnsberg's collections of Duchamps in Los Angeles. And so what this is all like, I guess, doing for me is like just being like, yeah, like we do these kinds of neat periodizations, but artist influences and relationships allows us to see the ways in which kind of works flow through and across those kind of arbitrary divides. And I think that's something that I felt very deeply in your show as well. You know, I would say arbitrary divides, not just in terms of temporality, but, you know, thinking about that vignette that I would love to hear more about how it came about, that you showed in your slideshow of the recreation of the filling station costume, like that, like gorgeous, translucent, you know, rimmed in bright red with a bright red heart against the Ellie Nadelman. When I walked out of the Whitney's elevators on the 8th floor and looked to my right and saw that, I was like, oh my God, like he gets it, because here the folk, you know, the folk of Americana, of a gas station on which that ballet was based, right, Mac, eroticism and also, you know, classicism are seen as related to each other as opposed to opposed. And that's another thing that categorization often does, is not allow us to see the ways in which artists bring these things together.
I mean, we talked a little bit about this, hearing you speak about influence, which is kind of such a big motor for me. And in a way, I would say that Transmissions was almost entirely tracing influence among artists. I mean, it's something that concerns me, and I get a lot of, there's sort of actually a lot of emotional information that I get out of tracing how artists kind of process each other and what they do with that. But when we were talking, there was this hilarious moment when you described the relationships that kind of spring up around Cornell that are, you know, very much like the constellations on Grand Central Station ceiling behind you. And you described it as having a galaxy brain.
Oh yeah.
Describe it. And, you know, I showed a map earlier where I was trying to understand relationships between people, and I kept drawing these maps over and over again. I was driving myself crazy. But they also became more and more diaphanous. Yeah, I mean, my question to you is whether that's something that happens to you as a historian often, or you think it's specific to this period and these people?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, it totally, I think I was telling you, I was like, yeah, like realizing that like Tibor Denage and John Bernard Myers, who's the editor, the managing editor of View, like met in the lobby of like the ballet, and that's like what like led to Tibor Denage, and like their first show, they wanted to have Cornell actually as their first show, and it didn't work out, and like, you know, just like stuff like that. As I said, you realize the density of these networks, which is why I kind of described it that way. But I think, you know, I think that as we mentioned, you know, the density of the networks, I think have to do on one hand with like queer genealogies. But on the other, like, I think it's just, I think that this is what's so brilliant about your work, is that ballet really was a galvanizing force, you know, in terms of just the performance, the audience, but also I think ballet has its own theory of history, which I would love to talk with Emily and Hilton about. And you know, I think what your question also points to, which I think is actually a major question that I have, that I was interested in my book project, and which I think really obsessed Cornell, is the kind of paradoxical nature of ephemeral experiences of relationships, you know, because the reason they feel like they accumulate so much is because they're constantly changing. They're not stable. Like you can like make as many lines between people as possible, but it'll never capture, you know, as you called it, diaphanous, I would say like the texture of those types of connections, right? And so I think that that's something Cornell, being so obsessed with like the past, you know, being like, I found this print of Fanny Cerrito, a 19th century ballet dancer, and I felt her in the present. But it's like, how do you make that material? How do you capture that in a work of art? And what does a work of art do that actually forecloses some of those connections? And so that was something else I wanted to ask you about, which was about, you know, the expansiveness of this versus the form of the exhibition or the book. Like, how did you know when you were done?
Well, as I said, I felt like the book, you know, I didn't want to finish it. And I think it kind of keeps casting out lines into other things. Something that the working on the exhibition and the book kind of gave me a method that I don't think I had in the same way before. And I do think it has to do with this material, with this range of material. And, you know, so many of the things on View were objects that are exchanged by hand. They're postcards, they're invitation cards, they're ballet programs. Somehow I felt like all these shifts took place once I was able to kind of see things through ballet, that also allowed me to think about work more generally. But you know, I also knew from the beginning that this was not going to be an exhaustive project, and that wasn't my task, that it was very fragmentary and full of holes, and in a way, almost as much about the holes as it was about, you know, the things that were there. So I could sort of let it be what it had to be. at a certain point. I'm going to segue to Hilton and then see you in a little bit.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Thanks.
Hi, Hilton. So literally the last thing that I saw before Sheltering in Place began was your exhibition, She Who Is, Adrienne Kennedy and the Drama of Difference at Artist Space. And
I was so touched to see you there. I think it was the last day I was there too. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I've been seeing your exhibitions, and actually, as I was thinking about them in advance of today, kind of overwhelmed by how generous they are. I mean, in the case of the Adrienne Kennedy exhibition, I was put into contact with an artist whose work I did not yet know, and I'm now still getting to learn about. But I had the feeling, as you were speaking about her work, that what you were doing to her work and her life was very close to what I know of your writing, but spatialized. The exhibition has this incredible sense of detail and veneration almost, but and then there's facts that are presented. There's all this evidentiary material, like her scripts and plans of the stages, but then also there's other facts in the form of images that stand in for dreams or ways in which you've inhabited her. And I really have the sense that she's woven into your life, that this is someone you've known for a long time, and that's the only way that you could make this show. And I mean, I have that sense very much with all the exhibitions that I see. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how the process works for you, because it always seems like there's a kind of central figure around whom the exhibition accumulates, and then it also maybe dissipates the description of that figure.
Well, I think I have nothing to add to that. Really, that is your sentence about what the shows are is deeply apt. I think it's a way of me, or a way for me to talk to a person who has moved into some other realm that is not exactly, or we've made a lot of this person in ways that dequalifies them as human beings, and meaning a human being that is not necessarily a human being is never a perfect thing, but humans can be a perfect vessel, I feel, for stories. And one of the things that happens, or that I'm trying to do in that kind of work, is to articulate the ways in which alchemy happens. How does this object or this event become part of this person and then leave that person out into the world, and then is transmitted to me or you or any other viewer? And how do we then remake that person's alchemy? It's sort of double, triple alchemy. It's coming from their sensibility to ours, to someone else's, to the museum space or the gallery space. And I love that kind of, it's almost kind of trying to make magical thinking manifest through objects. And I see that when I saw your show at the Whitney, I was so blown away to see and find someone else who had a similar feeling, in particular about what makes you an artist, A, but B, what is a gay sensibility in New York? What was profound to me, and I'm so glad that you have your book now and that other people can have it too, is it's a still weirdly unwritten chapter in New York cultural history. Lots of people go back to the 60s, right? And a little bit of the late 50s, but mostly a lot of, let's say, art world people start when Warhol started. And one of the things that I loved so deeply about your show was, let's call it the pre-Warhol sensibility that made Warhol. If that helps a wider audience understand what you were trying to do. It's not what I feel, but that's just a catchphrase that I've invented for people to have a context for what you were doing. Another reason that I felt very close to that exhibition was because I knew men of color from that generation who had been friends with Van Vechten and friends with plot lines and so on. So there, a man named Owen Dodson, who had been a big early influence of mine, who had been a friend and former lover of Gordon Heath, who had started the Abbey, which was a very famous kind of cafe in Paris in the 50s. But then I remember stories that Owen told me about Gielgud and other gay men in the theater, because Owen was a theater director at Howard and elsewhere, and that there was a lot of cross-pollination of artists. So it was just one of the things that made me feel so joyful in your exhibition was that it was what I remembered of his discussion of those years, and people like Gielgud and Belafonte and all these, Ruby Dee and all of these amazing people from the 40s and 50s and 60s who had contributed to that sensibility as well. So to answer your question in a very roundabout way, because I'm much more taken with what you have to say than I would, I feel on some level that I've never gotten over a childhood fear that people would be forgotten. And what I felt looking at your work, and hopefully there's a glimmer of this in mine, is how do we not forget this person that's been memorialized in a certain way, and how do we make them human and thus humane to us again, with all of the sort of messiness and cracks and inspiration that they've provided, because these shows couldn't happen if I didn't see a connection between the artists, or the artists weren't inspired by the figure, that the work revolves around. So it feels, for instance, in the James Baldwin show, in the second part of it, that was a lot of flickering lights and movies, and I wanted him to have energy again, to have a kind of corporeal presence that was about not only our joy in knowing James Baldwin as an artist, but him knowing us. That all of these younger artists had made work that really, if you read 2 pages of his stuff about films or whatever, was right there. That they didn't even realize they were making this kind of work until we made that connection in the exhibition. So the through line is very important to me, from A to B, from 1968 to whatever the years are. And I felt that in Transmissions as well, that it's very important for us to understand that we all, no matter how ephemeral, we come from somewhere. And it's the organizing principle of my curatorial ethos is the organizing principle of a child who didn't want anyone to be forgotten as they were, as opposed to the person that we make up. I didn't want it to be a fiction. The art is enough of a fiction. If we can have the the core of the artist be as truthful as possible, we can do anything around that.
I mean, there's this the emotion that you invest in these exhibitions is so palpable, but it also that seems to be the guide. I mean, not only it's interesting because the exhibitions are very rigorous and elegant and generous, as I said, but then there is this. Actually, I was saying this to Marcy, that there will be a moment where it feels like this is too personal to be in here. These moments, and that can be a kind of corner with a light over a picture. I mean, there are these gestures that you make that I think nonchalant is the wrong word, because they're actually, they are exactly what they have to be, that turn the entire exhibition into, a radical artistic medium that
Well,
I
thank
think
you.
you're very much using as an artist. And I mean, the way that I move through your exhibitions is so interesting because they're really not linear.
No.
I find myself retracing things all the time. I'm given space to sort of learn what's going on and understand where I am. And yeah, I mean, I know that you've spoken about, maybe it was about the emotional retrospective, the series of shows that you did with the artists, and where you created these environments. I definitely had that feeling in, there was one of the exhibitions was called The Romance of Certain Old Clothes.
Yes.
Cheryl Sutton, my sister, my mother, Senga Ngudi, and the rest, and it was just, incredible. I mean,
thank you. My sister had, it was very interesting. My sister had passed away, and several months before I was supposed to do the shows, and I wanted to make a kind of emotional autobiography that was for sure about my relationship to these women, but also to give them a space to make things. I always feel that once I gather, and if I'm putting things up, that they're really kind of involved. Mm-hmm. So there was Celia Paul, I had her send me her painting dress. She wears coats and skirts. And that actually, I'd forgotten about the smell of oil paint. And that when we put it in one room and closed the door, there was just, it permeated the space. And so I think that it really is about me trying to connect to people, and that I think there is a wound at the center of those shows, and that wound has a lot to do with missing people, missing not only their presence, but also the opportunity that they've given me to grow as a person and that they might give to you. I want to share a kind of spiritual enthusiasm for this person and their work. And I feel very fortunate to have been given the space to do that with people like Jenny Jaski and David Zwerner and so on. And I feel, and Jay Sanders, of course, the incomparable Jay. And I feel that in some way, it's weird to say this, but I feel that that this idea of what makes an exhibition has changed because life has changed so much that we can no longer put things on a wall to make linear sense, it has to make emotional sense for me first. It has to make visual sense to me, parallel to the emotional sense. It has to make visual sense. And sometimes, I mean, David has given me suggestions on the Baldwin that were just brilliant editorial suggestions where he would say, oh, I think if you help them here a little bit, and it was perfect to put a little piece of text, or and it wouldn't have to be enormous. So when you have a great editor like that, it's very helpful, because they also are leaving you alone to find the emotional energy of the thing. I think that what I'm ultimately very interested in making is atmospheres, you know, whether it's for people to dream or to reflect on the person, and to also be together in a kind of tribal way, to pay homage to this griot, this person who's done an extraordinary amount of work that is transformative. And how do we express being transformed in a gallery and museum space? What do they do to us? And what do we do to them? I think that's really what I want to create visually.
Yeah, thank you. Let's bring in Emily and
Thanks.
Marcy.
Hello.
So fun to listen.
It's been so great. I've been having so much fun listening to people, wondering how I could contribute. But I think that collectively it's been amazing, no?
I feel like we're in a Nick Maussian collage.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, a few things come to mind, actually. It's interesting having thought about your works and all of you and talk to you now, that there seems to be a kind of interest, I mean, in muse, the question of the muse, but also like the ambivalent muse. You know, I think there's something in the way that, I mean, I haven't read the Cornell book yet, Marcy, but the way that he functions as a figure that can sort of lead somewhere else. I'm not sure if that's correct.
Yeah.
But also the way that the muse functions in his work, which is very complicated and you know, sort of obsessional as far as I can tell. And then Emily, you have sort of this range of muses that kind of can be very layered and sort of shimmering in your work. Like I'm thinking of Incarnations, where you have Albert Einstein and Yvonne Rainer and Apollo and all these characters working together, and also sort of crashing into each other. And Hilton, as we just talked about, there's sort of these figures that you feel compelled to sort of pay tribute to in a way in these exhibitions.
Yeah.
I would, oh, go ahead, Marcy.
Please. Well, I guess what I would just say is, you know, I learned so much listening to both of you speak with Nick. You know, Emily, just like the way in which the history like lives in your own like experiences, and that's like completely inseparable. And Hilton, just, you know, the importance of the encounter, but also the lost figure, right? And in terms of this question of muse, you know, I think that it speaks to something that Hilton mentioned about the messiness of a person, which I think is so important. You know, it was very hard for me to write some parts of this book because, you know, I like, you know, spent many years like reading like everything Cornell like wrote and his archives, which are extensive. His diaries are actually all online in the Smithsonian. And eventually I had to come to terms with the fact that the way he deals with women is a kind of idealization, and idealization is a double-edged sword, right? It allows them to fly, but it's also can be a form of objectification. And I wanted to kind of capture that ambivalence, and his own ambivalence, his own kind of interplay of faith and doubt in a way, and actually that being the most humane and beautiful thing I could give to him. And so in some ways I had to like move away from the idealization. that comes with even, writing about a figure like this or writing about enchantment. And that was something that was, for me, a very, I would say, like embodied experience.
I'm curious, I mean, the way that you theorize enchantment, to speak about this time is of interest to me, or sort of, in a way, what I understand is that the kind of jettisoning of enchantment has brought us to the moment that we are in now. Or is that too strong to say?
I think that is part of the argument I'm making, and that's why, again, it excites me so much to see all of your work, where I think that the moment we're talking about, I think it must be said, is a moment similar to ours in terms of just the ways in which there's this mounting like real fear of fascism, right? Which they actually, a lot of these Americans are seeing coming across the country. Nadelman's family is Jewish in Poland. Many of them die in the camps. There is this kind of intensive dread, and that's preceded by the Depression and this desire, this sense that capitalism had like come to its end and like we needed a new kind of form of collectivity. And so, but with the rise of fascism, there's this question is like, why did it get like this? Which I think many of us are asking ourselves right now. And it's, one potential answer is the irrationality of everyone, and enchantment being by definition outside of rationality is something that becomes, politically suspect. And you see this in all sorts of ways. And I think that, what I would just say is that for me, the lesson in thinking about this work is one, thinking about Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler and View magazine, and the way they talked about fantasy and desire and individual experience, not just as individual, but as we've been talking about, as connected and relational, as precisely that which brings you outside of possessive individualism, and therefore as being the only site of anti-ideological thought, or the only potential of like kind of anti-ideological approaches. So kind of, the sense of not being afraid of like subjective experience, first of all. And second of all, like just the ways in which that this kind of very justifiable desire to have a kind of political significance in the face of just intensive, overwhelming devastation and tragedy was incredibly important, but also instantiated its own kind of hierarchy of importance. And I think what we're learning right now is that the goal isn't to instantiate a new hierarchy, it's to try to level and get rid of hierarchy altogether. And how does something like what we've all been talking about allow us to think in ways that aren't hierarchical around temporalities, around different types of bodies, around artistic media, is I guess what I would say.
In that vein, I really appreciated Hilton's comment about this childhood fear to not have people be forgotten and to know and to remember. And in terms of a kind of anti-hierarchy, just thinking about the different kinds of the unknowns who are remembered and brought forward in Nick's exhibition, but also the knowns, Lincoln Kirsten, for instance, getting presented in a new way, or the figures that Hilton has created exhibitions about, like Adrian Kennedy and James Baldwin, who are very known, but have been so mythologized perhaps as to pass beyond into actually being not really known for who that person originally was. I feel like in some sense, we're doomed to forget and we're doomed to mythologize. And that mythologizing is always going to, even an effort to pull away from mythologizing just mythologizes again in new ways, these histories.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean,
it's true that in the effort to not, it becomes more, because I don't think that they're facing the question of why first. You know, why would we do that? Why do we have a tendency as human beings, as much as we desire intimacy, we desire a kind of hero. And that's something that's very removed from the experience of being a human being. That has more to do with distance than it does with closeness. So I think we're all talking about not doing that on some level, you know.
But we do it in spite of our best efforts.
It's sort of like a human need. As much as touch is a human need, or expression, there's a need for a master narrative, one that's about a bigger person, or the person that is removed and did change things. But if we lose sight of the fact that they were human, we don't understand them, how the process happens of the work. We jettison history for mythology.
Especially in working on the book, I found myself compelled to make this choice that, for example, the visual artists in the book would not get biographies, but all the performers and all the lighting designers and all the people involved in performance, I would try to give as much information about them as I could, because it seemed that was something that's needed. And what's not needed is more information about Paul Cadmus or that kind of thing. I mean, it strikes me now as a bit sort of wooden of a decision, but I think, you know, just to kind of tilt the scale somehow and say, you know, this is about kind of widening the field and remembering these people, or trying to remember them. I mean, there were many performers who I could not find anything about anymore, or I just don't know the people, you know, that would know something about them. You know, you have probably known Hilton. Yeah, I mean, I did find myself at the same time kind of creating these myths around certain individuals too. So I think that's an important point that you bring up, Emily.
It's poignant to me that the Lincoln Kirsten I knew was an 80-year-old plus man, and that a towering figure in the milieu that he created could still be unknown by the 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds flooding there to study ballet in the home of what they knew was George Balanchine's home. So even when you have the person in the flesh, you have versions of a person over time, and you have contexts of knowing or not knowing.
You've written really beautifully about the notion of decay in particle physics, and how that applies to cultural objects, specifically dance. How dance actually, from the moment that it's performed, begins to decay. But I mean, I think it also applies to what we're talking about here in terms of memory. But it seems that you've managed to harness that as something to work with.
I think you too, right? I think we all do have in this process, taking these histories, it's to recognize their fragmentation and to take and disintegration and to take it and reform, represent, reimagine that that memory loss, right? And to conjure it in a new way, to inject new life into it, or new imagination and new vision in the moment. I see that in transmissions right and left. That is the project of transmissions.
I mean, it's wonderful to hear that, especially, yeah, from somebody who is so close to the material in a way that I can never understand, because I really, you know, this was an incredible kind of searching, learning experience, you know, I wanted to honor all the material and the histories as best as I could, but I think in many cases that was probably not possible. So I was afraid of somebody like you seeing this exhibition.
Me?
But I think that's part of what makes someone like Emily great is she knows, not to speak of you in the third person, Emily, but she knows that there's all different kinds of understanding. That it, you know, you might not have first-hand knowledge of what Lincoln Kirsten's voice sounded like or his gestures, but you had an understanding of his feeling for the subject. And these are the traces that they leave us, right? They leave us all these clues to decipher and to put together about who they are. And I think that that's also what's so moving about your book. It's very inspiring to kind of try to find a way to do a project that is about transitions in a lot of ways, from life to death, from movement to stillness, from museum constraints to the freedom of moving through space. There are lots of those dichotomies that you're working with in the book, and I think that your mind had to be free to do that. You couldn't have the weight of those people, knowing those people, and do that kind of show. I didn't, you know, I knew Toni Morrison some. She's the next person that I'm working with. But I think if I was an intimate of Baldwin's or Adrian's or Henry James, I would feel more constricted. My imagination wouldn't be free to roam in a way.
Nick,
there's no dead material, just dead thoughts, you know?
Nick has this really great quote that I've had here and keep returning to. In your conversation with the dancers, they're talking about their relationship to technique, and you, a visual artist trained in a different way, plunked down in the middle of them. You say, I associate the practice of technique with a way of being articulate. I'm trying to renegotiate my own relationship to technique and what that could mean. And I'm curious, with transmissions, do you feel you accomplished that? And what does that look like? And did physical practitioners inspire that and guide you in that journey in some way?
That's a great question. Certainly that this way of working was inspired by it was inspired by things I read first. It was inspired by theories of history. It was someone I thought about a lot was Joan Scott and the fantasy of feminist history, and it's sort of how that would be a space that could be used even in the museum, which is ostensibly the place of a kind of omniscient history. But then, of course, there were people also like Hilton seeing his exhibitions. There were, I think, years upon years of things that I saw. someone like Fred Wilson. It's so hard for me to now figure out this kind of polyhedron, but it came together in a certain urgency, and I was lucky to work with two wonderful curators who let this project unfold exactly as it had to, and intervened in exactly the right moment. So as you were saying, Hilton, they were incredible editors, Scott Rothkopf and Elizabeth Sussman, who Elizabeth really kind of followed this project over years and years and let it emerge. And she taught me a lot about how ideas kind of open up and sort of when you need to kind of keep pushing them further. But yeah, I think there's something, and I wonder how you all feel about this with regard to your own work. There was also a kind of violence that I wanted to work against. That was really, that kind of put a focus on everything. And I think maybe, I'm not answering your question, but if I feel that there was a kind of technique, it emerged out of that I sort of knew what had to be done because I was looking at these objects and they told me what had to be done, so that they weren't mistreated again.
I love that you don't want them to be mistreated again. That's beautiful. It becomes very sort of like a very loving caretaker, assembling sentences to make a paragraph, sentenced about Merce's toe shoes, early toe shoes, or a sentence about the menage a trois with flat lines, or a sentence about ballet theater. These are all sentences that added up to a story. That's what that's the real big impulse, is to tell a story.
Yeah, to me, the violence that you're talking about, I'm not exactly sure if you're using it in this way, but I think it actually speaks to something, those dichotomies that Hilton mentioned you working through. And the violence is an attempt to freeze something to suit your own needs, and not in some ways honor the change, and honor its kind of its fluidity, its complexity. And I think that, in what I saw in this exhibition was, yes, like a kind of like tender care, but it's also, I think, like, in asking the objects to speak to you, it's a way of refusing mastery, which I think is really important when we're talking about things as delicate as these.
That's right. That's a great sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah, because what does that mean? One of the things that I hated so much in college was this is a long time ago, but a requirement was a connoisseurship class. And I truly did not understand what they were talking about. For, weeks would go by and I'd read along with everyone else, Bernard Berenson's journals, all of that stuff. And it occurred to me that what they meant by connoisseurship was that you had the money to go to the place to look at where the thing was. That you could make a life around the seasons, that you could go to hear Wagner in the summer, that you could go look at paintings in the fall in Rome. And once I understood that, I realized that there was no authority, that there was a class, but there was no authority about what a work, the value of a given work, that you had class functions around art. and not that someone knew better than another person.
Mhm.
I think, we brought up Walter Hopps is a great example of that. Someone who was just so passionate about learning, and that he wanted to, he was in love with the things that he fell in love with. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't anything but sensitive to the material and learning about the material. So I think Marcy is correct. It is a refusal of mastery, because it's so specious, that term. It actually used to drive me nuts. I thought I was crazy sitting in this class, and this Columbia was an all-boys school then too. And I'm sitting there, and I'm, a fairly intelligent person. I did not understand what connoisseurship meant until I began to understand that it was about class and lifestyle, not about what you saw. Wow, it was really amazing. But I'm so glad you said that, Marcy. It's so important.
There's another hierarchy here between performance and visual material and visual object. And Nick and I have had conversations about this, where there's a real nostalgia and a real mourning in dance history for what was, because you will never be able to see that Jacques d'Amboise performance as it was in, the 1950s, the 1960s. You can see it captured on film, but you can't experience it live. And I had written to Nick, the way you don't mourn a Picasso, because you can stand in front of the Picasso and the Picasso's not going anywhere. The object is the object. But of course, I think something in Transmissions also levels that hierarchy, because visual materials do get lost and do not persist. And many of the print materials, Nick, that you pulled out and have in the book and had in the exhibition, objects get stashed and stored at the dance collection, in the MoMA collection, buried away, and they might as well be mourned too, as much as performance is mourned.
Well, I think this, the nostalgia that you bring up, or this, the hierarchy between the performances that can no longer be and the artwork that persists, that lasts. I had a weird moment in making this exhibition where I realized that because I was looking at a form that I didn't know, and I was sort of like denaturalizing ballet, it also allowed me to do the same thing to the way that I was approaching art. So that suddenly the conventions that make art valuable in a certain way or meaningful, give it historical weight, I could kind of toss them aside, but only because I was looking at the few traces that do remain after performances, and somehow what it made me realize is that the audience, and this brings to mind what Hilton was saying before when he's talking about not only what do the subjects of his exhibitions give us, but what do we give them. That crucial role of the people who are actually taking in what is being made and who are remembering it. That was something I had never thought about as much before I started working in this domain. I think there is nostalgia is one word for it, but there's also for me to understand that audiences are not always the same, and art, the way it's perceived, that is not a transhistorical thing. Sexuality is not transhistorical. All these things, as Marcy is saying, keep changing. That was that was crucial. And somehow, you know, that's what remains with me from this project, and I think will kind of flood everything else.
Isn't it nice, Nick, that your work has encouraged so much feeling?
Well, thank you all for you know, engaging with it like this, and for being here tonight. And I'm just I'm so happy that you could all meet because I love what you all do, and I feel like you should meet. But yeah, really, thank you for taking this time and for being so wonderful and insightful. And
I know I wasn't part of the conversation, but I feel like I have to acknowledge the first curator of the dance division, Gigi Oswald, who told me and said to many people, which is true with all archives, but really true in the case of dance, that when she was collecting, she started from an acknowledgement that she was collecting around a central absence, and that was her guiding principle for how she built out the dance division's collections, was to understand, just as Emily said, that in the moment of making dance, it's dying, which always makes me think of the Derridian, you know, idea of the death drive being an inherent part of archival work. And it's due to her that so many of these materials are here, not buried away, but completely accessible to the public. So I feel like she's the sort of background force in much of what has been discussed tonight. So I just offer that up as my one observation on a fantastic conversation. I'd like to thank Hilton Als, Emily Coates, Marcy Kwan, and of course, the wonderful Nick Mauss for this conversation this evening. Nick, your book, Transmissions, I imagine is available through the Whitney's website. Is that correct?
yes, through the Whitney's website and my publisher, Dancing Foxes Press.
Okay, and if for some reason you need to see the book before you decide to buy the book, of course, the library has a copy available to borrow. Yeah, thank you, Emily. Nice Vanna Whiting. I just want to mention two upcoming programs. On February 24th, our ongoing series, David Vaughan's The Dance Historian is in. We'll have guest host Trili Harjito, who's an Indonesian dance scholar. She'll specifically be speaking about her research on Javanese dance. And then very appropriate, again, for the conversation we've been having tonight, on February 26th, we'll be holding a public memorial for the dance writer Sally Baines, who wrote so many seminal and influential essays on the history of dance. And there are a wealth of guest speakers attending. The public hours will be 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. And so I hope people can come and pay their respects and celebrate Sally's life. Again, thank you so much to all of our panelists and from all of us here at the Jerome Robbins Dance Division. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Nick. Come home soon. Come home soon.